Hey everyone, it's Colin. How's it going? Cloud computing is huge. We all depend on it in one way or another, and it's going to completely overhaul the way that companies handle their IT. Or is it? When it comes to talking about the cloud, I think the first thing we need to do is actually nail down the terminology, because I feel it's one of those industry trend type of terms that a lot of people love to spout off, but they don't quite understand exactly what it means or what it encompasses. In general, it's referring to hosted computing of some sort, right? The idea is, instead of you running your own services on equipment that you have on your own premises, if you're a business in some sort of server room or data center, you instead farm it out to another company to do for you. Either you simply pay them to run the service, or you rent basically equipment from them in one of their facilities instead of you doing it yourself. But that's where the big breakdown is. A lot of people like to just say, oh, we're doing things in the cloud, but they don't necessarily know how deep that goes or what that really means. As far as I can tell, there are really about three types of cloud computing. The first one is like one of the examples that I just gave, basically running virtual machines. So instead of, say, having a whole bunch of servers on premises at your business, you instead spin up virtual machines at a cloud provider. And they will give you the ability to set up those VMs however you want. You can run whatever operating system on there that you need. You're able to configure all of the settings within those VMs. So you can say how much RAM and how much hard drive space and how much processor power you need. You're able to get in, configure all of the networking so stuff can talk to each other. And then, of course, you get from the operating system level, you can install whatever applications you want. Basically, they give you kind of a blank slate within a compartmentalized nature. The next section or next category is really shared hosting, or VPS, where you have just a portion of a virtual machine. You can do what you want within that portion, but you don't have full access to everything, right? You can't go in and reconfigure, oh, I want more CPU power, or I want more RAM, or I want more disk. Generally, those are predefined things, and you can request more, but you don't have the ability to necessarily push that button yourself. Likewise, you can't also necessarily install whatever applications you want. Generally, the shared hosting kind of stuff is going to be for specific applications. The classic example is going to be web hosting. So maybe you've got a small website. You want to be able to go in and configure all of the web pages and functionality and files and everything exactly how you want, but you need a fairly cookie cutter type of setup. They're not going to give you full access to the operating system that your site runs on, because chances are there are other customers running their own sites on that same virtual machine, or even maybe a physical machine. What they'll do is they'll give you a login so you can connect and maybe upload your files, do some basic configuration, but you're pretty well sandboxed in that environment. So that's shared hosting. The third type really is the newest category, and it's called SaaS, or Software as a Service. And the idea is you don't even get that file level access. You basically sign up for a very specific application, and they build it and maintain it and run it for you, and all you do is really just consume that application. A fantastic example of this is something like webmail. If you have a Gmail account, that's SaaS. You're not able to go into the Gmail servers and configure things like that. You can't do specific settings as to exactly how you want the Gmail service to operate. In general, you've got some buttons and knobs you can tweak, but those are more preferences about your account than anything else. You don't really get any access to the nuts and bolts. In the case of Gmail, Google just does all of that for you. But it goes much, much farther than just email. There are lots of different applications that you can get in that type of model. And it is kind of appealing in some cases, simply because there's so much less that you have to deal with, right? You don't really need to go in and worry about, oh, do I have things configured correctly, or software updates, patches, maintenance, any of that kind of stuff. You just use it and somebody else handles it all for you. So those really are the three types. Now, none of this, believe it or not, is actually a new concept. The term cloud computing may be, relatively new. It's been around for a few years now, but everyone seems to think, oh, this is this brand new thing and it's this, new way that the industry is going. We've actually been seeing this for a while. It, in fact, even goes back decades. If you ever had internet access in, say, the mid to late 90s, you may remember that when you signed up with your internet service provider, more often than not, they gave you an email account and also some web space where you could host your own little personal website. Guess what both of those were? The email was going to be considered SaaS because you generally couldn't get in and reconfigure the email server yourself. You just got an account on one that the ISP managed. And then the web hosting was often considered that shared hosting or VPS model where they'd give you, say, an FTP login where you could go in and upload your files and make some config changes to the way your site worked, but they'd have all those other customers running on the same server, so you really couldn't get into the nuts and bolts. This has been going on for decades. It's really only the whole expansion of SaaS that's new, where you can get many more different types of applications. And then also access to full virtual machines, basically virtualized infrastructure. Those are really the bolt-on types of things that are new to cloud computing. But it's a little frustrating when people are always talking about, oh, cloud computing, it's this brand new thing. No, it's not. It's simply evolved over time. The landscape for it, who offers these types of services, it's in some ways broadened, but it's also consolidated. There, at this point, at least in the US, are three major providers of cloud services in general. They are going to be AWS, which is Amazon, Google Compute, and then Microsoft's Azure platform. And they all pretty much do the same thing in terms of the virtualized infrastructure type of piece. Like if you're a company and you have a need to run all sorts of different programs, but they're maybe very custom and there's no SaaS type of model that would work for it. You need to be able to get in and update the code and make changes yourself. Some companies have been heading in this direction where they simply spin up a bunch of virtual machines out in the cloud on one of these providers. And so one of those three are really the big industry leaders, at least as far as the US is concerned. There are some other players that are a little more niche in nature, but are kind of nipping at the heels. A couple that come to mind are Rackspace and Linode. They can be a bit specialized. They may not offer the same level of scale or flexibility, but sometimes they can win on price. It really just comes down to the specific features that you're looking for and, of course, the scale at which you need to be able to grow. But it's generally going to be one of those three providers if you're working, say, in IT and your boss comes to you and says, hey, we need to look into moving stuff to the cloud. AWS, Google, or Azure are generally going to be the three companies that you'll first look at and get comparison price quotes from, that sort of thing. So what's the main appeal to moving to the cloud? Why are people in IT management and all these really big companies even going that way to begin with? Well, there's a few things that the cloud does really, really well and can save time and or money depending on the organization that you work for and the use case that you have. The first thing is that it can lower the cost of IT for smaller businesses. And this can come in one of two ways. Either it can lower the actual cost in terms of buying stuff. If you're a small business, you don't want to spend thousands of dollars on buying servers and network stuff and really fast internet connection if you say host your own website. You don't want to spend that money building out a proper server room or closet or data center or anything like that. It's really quick and cheap to spin up the relatively small number of resources that you need out in the cloud because it's just point click and they've pretty much automated setting a lot of the stuff up on the back end for you. And this is including setting up your own virtual machines that you can configure exactly how you want. But there's also the whole SaaS model as well, where, instead of needing to spend thousands of dollars to buy and build your own email server that you run in your, business office somewhere and having to maintain it and fix it when it breaks and all that. At some point it's easier just to go with that SaaS model and get hosted email from some provider and just let them handle all of that for you. So there's definitely some cost savings. Plus it's just faster to set up. A lot of that stuff, it's point click, you're done. Now, hey, you've got an email account that works instead of having to wait for servers to ship and show up and you load them and configure them and troubleshoot them and all that. The other thing that it can help small businesses specifically with is their labor costs. You don't necessarily need to have people spend so much time managing all of your IT resources. They can either work on other stuff, or maybe you just don't need to hire as many because a lot of those factors have been taken out. In terms of maintaining servers and if parts break and that kind of stuff, if all of your infrastructure runs out in the cloud, well, you don't really have to worry about that. You're paying somebody else to do that for you, and that's their job. They do it all the time, so they're probably going to be pretty good at it. They're going to have a lot of resources at their disposal that would be really expensive and time-consuming for you to get yourself, especially if you're a small business. So that's really the big appeal, is if you want to get a business off the ground, the upfront cost is much, much lower. And if you're a small or maybe even medium-sized business, it can help reduce your overhead by migrating out to these cloud services. But what if you're not a small business? What if you're a really big company? Well, there can be some major benefits to going to the cloud for you as well, because of the flexible nature a lot of those platforms offer. A great example is going to be Netflix. Netflix is very highly dependent on AWS. At least in the US, the majority of Netflix runs on Amazon Web Services. And this was intentional on their part. They used to have a lot of servers that they ran themselves, but they've moved towards AWS because it'll actually save them time and money in the long run. Yeah, they're giving up some control, but here's a great use case. So Netflix, you can imagine, they've got a ton of servers, right? There's a lot of video that they're streaming out to customers all the time. So they need a lot of servers to power that. They need a lot of networking behind that as well. Now, a lot of those servers, though, are going to be identical, right? They're going to be cookie cutter. They're all going to have access to the same pool of content, and the only reason they need so many servers is simply because they're trying to service so many customers simultaneously. Now, when you've got really cookie cutter stuff like that, and you've got it at really big scale, chances are you're going to hire some smart software developers to try and optimize it. And that's, of course, what Netflix did. So what Netflix has is the ability to turn systems on and off on the fly based on demand. And this is one of the really, really big things that cloud computing is great at, is this flexible demand type of usage where if you don't need a whole lot of resources, you can programmatically turn some of them off. And if you need more, you can programmatically turn some of them on. So here's an example. Let's say during the middle of the day, Netflix usage is kind of moderate, right? Maybe you've got a decent number of your subscribers watching video, but not all of them. Later on in the day, you get towards, and past dinner time. You're in the evening, people are home from work, they've finished eating family dinner or whatever. They want to sit down in front of the TV and they want to watch a movie or TV show or whatever. Obviously, usage is going to spike. And this is prime time for Netflix, right? After dinner, before bedtime, so many people are watching it. So obviously their utilization is going to go up. The servers are going to start getting hammered with requests for people wanting to watch video. And if they stuck with the same number of servers that they had scaled appropriately for, say, during the middle of the day when not as many people were watching, then they'd have really, really bad service quality. That's when you'd start seeing some crazy problems with buffering or glitches if you're flipping through the interface to try and find something to watch. Maybe the movie stalls, it just crashes out on you, whatever. They would just be overloaded. So what Netflix does is, as usage goes up, they basically turn on more servers. And all these servers are designed in such a way where they can just join the pool of other servers and help distribute that load more evenly. So what you end up with is the number of servers that are running is directly proportional to the amount of load that the service is experiencing. So you only need to run as many servers as you basically have people watching. Now, part of the way that cloud services charge customers is based on not just the amount of resources that you need in terms of RAM and CPU and hard drive space and all that, but just how long each one of those virtual servers is powered on. And a lot of those services will even charge you by the hour, if not the minute. Instead of it being a flat, well, we're going to charge you X amount per month per server, it's more, we're going to charge you X amount per server per hour. That can represent a substantial savings for a big customer like Netflix because the ratios will still stay the same, right? If you've got an increase in the number of customers, you're going to see an increase in utilization of the servers, and so you're also going to see an increase in the cost that you have to run those servers. But if you're seeing an overall trending growth in the number of customers, that means you've got more revenue coming in. So even though your bill is going up to run that service, the revenue to you is coming in at a greater rate. So it all stays really proportional. And if there are certain quiet times during the day when the majority of people aren't watching, like really, really early in the morning, then you can spin down a lot of those resources and save money. You only need basically as many virtual servers as necessary to handle the load. You can just turn off and not get charged for what you don't need to use. So that level of flexibility is really, really killer for these big companies. Amazon, of course, deals with this as well. That's actually what AWS was founded on, was the need for the Amazon website to basically never go down. The goal was the busiest shopping day of the year, Amazon.com should run just as fast and just as smoothly as it would on the quietest shopping day of the year. So they overbuilt their infrastructure, but made it really dynamic in order to be able to achieve that goal. Some other benefits to cloud computing is the perceived enhanced reliability, right? All of this equipment is running in, professionally built and designed data centers, just massive, massive spaces full of racks of equipment. They've got dedicated staff that manage all of that stuff. They monitor all of it really, really closely. If anything goes wrong, they're in there to fix it really quickly. Plus, there's lots of redundancy built into these systems for cooling and power and network access. Distributed computing, they can move loads from one place to another if certain sections are having trouble or struggling. Lots and lots of really smart decisions made in these cloud computing environments to try and give really, really good reliability. And that, of course, also leads to fewer internal staff needed for the businesses that take advantage of cloud computing. So you think of a place like Netflix, and, they used to have just tons and tons of servers and data centers and stuff like that. Well, they don't necessarily need all those people to run all that stuff anymore. They've just pushed it off to a cloud provider and they pay them to deal with it. So again, you're seeing a case where those people can either go on and do other sorts of work, or maybe they just don't need that headcount anymore and the company overall can save some money. It really just becomes more of a software thing for them at that point than having to be both software and managing hardware. So with all of the really good stuff that the cloud offers, where does it fall flat on its face? Why don't I think it's going to take over absolutely everything? Well, it's because of the way that it works and the things that you have to give up when you move to the cloud. Now, this isn't going to be the same case for every single business, but I would say that a majority of IT resources are used by medium to larger businesses, not necessarily gigantic ones like Netflix or Amazon, anybody like that, but medium-sized businesses. Places with a few hundred to a few thousand employees, that sort of thing. The cloud is a really difficult proposition for businesses like that. The first thing is because of the billing. Believe it or not, pushing all of your infrastructure out to the cloud can cost you more in some cases than if you ran it in-house. Now, if you have absolutely nothing, if you're a startup business and you start really small, you've got just a few employees and you scale up from there, with zero IT investment otherwise, the cloud can actually be a better deal for a longer term for you as your company grows. But if you're an established business, you've been doing it for years, you've already got an on-premise IT environment with servers and a data center and established networking and staff to support all of it and everything, the amount of money that you'll save by throwing some of that away and moving out to the cloud is actually minimal, right? Because again, of the way that the cloud services are billed, it's billed by the hour or the day. Sometimes you get price breaks if you buy for an entire month's worth of uptime or an entire year's worth of uptime, but it's still not that great. And that's because of the use case for companies like that. In the previous example of Netflix, they run really just one service, right? It's one application. Yeah, Netflix has some internal systems that they use for dealing with payroll and accounts and internal kind of just business operations. But really, the majority of Netflix's IT presence is streaming video, right? It's just streaming video out to customers. And like we said, that's really, really cookie cutter. Most businesses aren't like that, though. Most businesses have a pretty diverse set of systems that they run internally or externally for whatever business aspect that they're in. So you've got businesses that need access, of course, to things like email and productivity suite, but also their ERP, basically the software that they use to manage all the money in the business, plus all the add-on module kind of stuff like that for payroll and HR, all of the kind of internal business workings for the company itself. And those can take a lot of systems. And then whatever specialized kind of stuff that the company does. Maybe you need some sort of contact management sort of application to keep all of your salespeople on the same page and able to quickly get information about customers and prospective leads and make them be productive when they're out meeting with people, that sort of stuff. Maybe you manufacture things and you have internal systems that are necessary as part of your manufacturing process. Maybe you have engineering systems. Maybe you have machinery control systems. Just a wide variety of things. But the biggest common factor amongst all of those systems that these medium and large businesses need is that all those systems need to be on all the time. You generally only are going to have like one or two of each kind of thing, right? You're not going to have like 10,000 servers all doing one thing, and that's the majority of your presence. Not like Netflix. You're just going to have onesie twosie of all of this wide variety of stuff that needs to be up and running 24/7 because you've got people around the world or across the country, whatever, that need to access it. So that whole scalable model of you only pay for what you use kind of falls flat on its face if you were to move out to the cloud. Everything that you were to move to the cloud would need to be up and running 24/7, 365. Now, I did a really quick check for Amazon Web Services, and the pricing between all these services is actually pretty similar. They're very competitive, at least between AWS and Google and Microsoft Azure. But as an example, I spec'd out a virtual machine running on AWS with 2 CPU cores, 4 gig of RAM, 60 gigabytes of hard disk storage, and then 40 gigabytes of data transfer. Now, running 24/7, you're looking at $52 a month for that one VM. Now, what if you've got a few hundred systems that you need to run? That's a big chunk of change. And that's a chunk of change that could go towards buying or maintaining your on-prem infrastructure. So there's this size gap, right? Where the cloud just doesn't make even financial sense for certain sizes of companies. And I feel like the companies that fall into that space where it really doesn't make the most sense happens to be the majority of companies around the world, the majority of these medium to somewhat large kind of companies, where you're not gigantic like Netflix and need thousands upon thousands, but you're not tiny either, where you can get by with just all of the cloud hosted stuff. If you're a medium or large company, you're going to be doing some custom things in your environment, and you probably have them all set up in a very specific way. So you can't really take that cookie cutter type of approach. The other thing about cloud computing that people don't necessarily account for when they're thinking about the money aspect is, okay, yeah, that one example VM that I gave you, $52 a month. Notice that I also said it includes 40 gigabytes of data transfer. And that's because these cloud providers will generally charge you not just for the resources that you use in terms of compute, like an actual VM, but they'll also charge you for the network transfer that you use. They may offer really, really fast access to the internet where you can get data in and out really, really quickly, but they're going to bill you based on how much data you actually move, unless it's all within their own environment. So let's say you run a really busy website and you decide, you know what, I like the reliability and the ease of use of having a big provider host that for me. Okay, that's reasonable. But if it's a super busy website, don't forget you're also going to be paying for that network bandwidth of people browsing to your website. So there comes kind of a point where it may actually make more sense to bring that back in-house if you're a business, right? Because usually internet service providers, even at the corporate level, if you're buying like a commercial, really high quality network service, high bandwidth, they're not going to charge you for the actual data usage. Not like you see with, say, a smartphone where you only get 5 gigabytes of usage a month. I've worked in IT for a very long time, and I've had to deal with ISPs for a very long time, and not once have they ever brought up the concept of picking how much bandwidth we need in terms of like actual data transfer for just a regular internet connection in one of our office buildings. So these are all factors that you have to consider. So if you're talking about taking your entire infrastructure and pushing it out into the cloud, all of your servers, you're going to be paying not just for those servers to be up and running out in the cloud, but you're also going to be paying for your own employees to send data to and from them from one of your own offices, or if they work at home. It's just another kind of hidden part of the equation that not many people think about, but is also going to be really variable. And I should speak very quickly. The accounting people in businesses love consistent recurring costs, right? They don't like having to spend a big chunk of money once and then wait a long time and then spend another big chunk of money. In general, the accounting people love to see very consistent, even bills every month. Oh, it's $300 a month for this one thing, and it's that same way every month for an entire year. They love that because that makes for really easy accounting. When you're pushing stuff out to the cloud, yeah, the VMs themselves, if you leave them up and running all the time, they're going to be that consistent cost. But based on how people use it, the actual bill is going to fluctuate up and down greatly. And they can get a little upset with you if one month your website or your service is super busy and the next month, not so much. Another thing to consider with the cloud and moving resources out there is security. Now, we've talked about how reliable and everything these data centers are, and they truly are. They're built very well, and the people that run them really know what they're doing. And the security, physical security aspect to data centers is also top-notch. A lot of times it's a situation where you need to be on an approved person's list to be able to get into the facility, and you have to check in at a reception desk and, show your ID to a security guard. If you're renting physical space, maybe you put some of your own equipment in a data center, then you often will have an access code and you need to go through what they call a man trap, where it's 2 doors and you open one door, you walk in, the door behind you closes and locks, and you have to put in a code, and then the next door goes in. So unauthorized people can't tailgate you into the facility, that sort of stuff. So physical security at these cloud providers is generally really, really good. The downside is that cloud providers are just as vulnerable to software exploits as anybody else. They're generally going to be running on commodity hardware. So the whole, as I'm filming this, the Meltdown and Spectre attacks, if you've ever heard about those in the news, talking about basically CPU vulnerabilities and how you can run arbitrary code and actually manipulate or at least get access to the contents of protected memory and systems, that sort of stuff. All the cloud providers are just as vulnerable to that as if you were running servers in your own facility at your business. They all had to go through and run patches on all their systems. Now, here's the thing that kind of stinks is if you're running a SaaS application, if you're just buying, say, email hosting or something from somebody, generally you don't really have to worry about that so much, just as long as you have reasonable confidence that that company actually does maintenance and keeps up to date with security patches and all that kind of stuff. But if you've pushed all your infrastructure out there where you're running the VMs yourselves, yeah, the cloud provider may patch the hypervisor, the actual physical hardware that your virtual machines run on, but patching the operating system on those is still up to you. The cloud doesn't make things magic. It doesn't mean that you don't have any maintenance to do anymore. You still have maintenance to do. All it really does is cut out the physical maintenance. So if you don't go in and apply software patches to your systems running out in the cloud, then you are just as vulnerable as if you hadn't moved to the cloud to begin with. And that's another thing that's lost, I think, a lot of the times on the business types. They think the cloud is magic. They think it means you just push a button and it spins up and that's it. You never have to touch it again. No, all it really does is just shift the cost for the physical infrastructure. And there actually have been theoretical attacks where one compromised virtual machine could actually attack the hypervisor that it's running on to be able to manipulate or at least read the data out of another virtual machine on that same system. So that's another level of concern when it comes to shared systems like cloud providers. You don't necessarily know what other systems are going to be running on the same hardware as your systems. There are cases where you can, basically get dedicated hardware that your virtual machines are run on, where you can cut a deal with the cloud provider. Hey, I want, my own hardware in this space, or at least hardware that's just for my own business. They'll charge you accordingly for that because economy of scale, having a whole bunch of stuff that's easily moved all over the place, is where the cloud providers basically are able to offer the prices that they are. But otherwise, in most cases, you don't know what other virtual machines are running on the same piece of hardware as yours. So if you are doing everything correctly, that's great, but it doesn't mean that it's not possible that you can't be affected or compromised if another customer whose system happens to be running on that same physical hardware isn't doing their job correctly. And speaking of that physical hardware, while the reliability of cloud providers is generally very good, it's not 100%. It never can be. Like I said, a lot of these virtual machines are still running on commodity hardware. They're running on traditional servers and traditional server architectures. The normal laws of how equipment work still apply. Power supplies are still going to fail. Motherboards are still going to fry, all that kind of stuff. And all of your virtual machines that you may push out to the cloud are still going to be running on top of what's called a hypervisor, basically the thing that manages all the virtual machines that are running on one physical server. That hypervisor is software and it's going to occasionally crash. There may be bugs in it and patches that need to be done. So just because they may offer better reliability than you could provide in-house doesn't mean that it's going to be perfect. And it's always really funny when I see that a cloud provider has had some sort of outage. Most of the time, the outages are actually due to human error. And that's another huge factor of it, is it's like, yeah, you may be pushing all of these management tasks off to a company that's supposed to, be able to do it better than you can, but they're still going to have people that make mistakes too. It seems like once or twice a year, we hear stories about Amazon is having a major outage in this one part of the country, or Google or Microsoft is having major hiccups in another part of the country, that sort of thing. A lot of times that's due to human error. And tying to that, most of the times when those human errors occur, it's actually due to network access and network routing, being able to get the traffic in and out of that data center. Sometimes it has to do with the physical data center where maintenance just goes wrong and say the power drops, even though there are redundant systems to keep it up and running. Maybe there's some massive cooling failure, something like that. But more often than not, it's due to data access, data routing, getting stuff in and out. Again, there are mitigations for all this kind of stuff, but they cost money. It means setting up systems in multiple regions or multiple data centers. Maybe you've got a lot of your systems running out of the East Coast, but then you have to run some out of the West Coast in case the East Coast goes down or whatever. And that's just a ton of money, not just in terms of what you're paying the cloud provider, because now you've got two copies of all of your systems running, but you also have to design and maintain your systems in such a way that you can have two copies of everything running, right? How do you keep data in sync between those two facilities? Lots and lots of considerations there. So again, this is where I really kind of think the cloud isn't necessarily going to take over everything, just because, if not the complexity of getting the true benefit of what the premise of the cloud can offer, it's the cost. These companies want to make money, and they're trying to optimize costs as best they can. But in some ways, you're just going to get nickeled and dimed to death if you're a small or medium-sized business. So I really don't think that on-prem type of services are going to be going away anytime soon. I think companies are still going to be buying servers and putting them in their own data centers that they control themselves, because in some ways that's a lot cheaper and a lot easier. Yeah, there are some risks to doing it that way, but in some cases, I think actually a lot of cases, the risks are really more a matter of perception than they are statistics, right? A service may say, oh, we've got, so much reliability, the average downtime is 5 minutes a year. Well, for a business, over a course of a year, is 5 minutes versus, say, 5 hours really that big of a difference? If you're able to get your particular company reliable enough to say, we only have an average of 5 hours worth of downtime every year, if it's less expensive and easier to maintain than going for that 5 minutes, well, that 5 hours may pay for itself. It's a very careful calculation that you have to make, but more often than not, it's not that much money. You don't lose that much money in that hour, 2 hours, or whatever that you may have a service hiccup versus pushing it out to the cloud. And finally, one last little bit. When you move things out to the cloud, you are entirely, of course, dependent on that cloud provider to find and fix any errors. When you've got people on site managing all of your systems, you've got someone you can walk over to and ask, hey, this is broken, what's wrong? How long do you think it's going to take to fix? Do we have the spare parts to fix that? Is there something else that we can do to get that going faster? That sort of thing. You've got someone you can actually get detailed information from. When it's out at the cloud, all the more you usually get is, yeah, sorry, we're having a hiccup, we're working on it. And that's it. Sometimes you'll get an ETA, but more often than not, you don't. And, a few minutes or hours go by and suddenly it's working again. And you may not even get an explanation as to what happened. So business owners or the manager type of people really don't like it when they don't have information like that. In some ways, as IT people, we kind of prefer it that way because, you know what? If it's a problem at the cloud provider, I can just be like, yeah, I can't fix it. It's out at the cloud provider. I don't know what their deal is. I don't have any information from them. You can see all the more information than I can. I don't know. I'm just going to go back and do some other work while they fix it. Whereas if something breaks, on site, you have to go and fix it yourself and you've got somebody breathing down your neck, that sort of thing. But overall, the communication is better if you're running the stuff yourself. Now, don't get me wrong. I don't think the cloud is a bad thing, right? I actually like the cloud in a lot of ways. Where I think we're really going to go is seeing a more hybrid approach. I don't think it's appropriate in most cases to just dump all of your stuff out to the cloud and say, you know what, I'm done with it. I think it's going to take a lot more careful consideration as to what should be out in the cloud versus what you should still run yourself. Some great examples of stuff that absolutely belongs out in the cloud just because of the cost or the reliability or just the fact that you don't have to deal with it. Things like email. Email is an absolute commodity. Every business pretty much needs and uses email. There's absolutely no reason you should be running email on servers on your own site anymore. That should totally go out into the cloud. Google Apps is $5 per user per month. Pay the money, push it out there, never worried about it again. Email is a great thing that should be out in the cloud. Other things like websites, right? Those are generally going to be pretty simple from an infrastructure standpoint, as long as you're not doing something crazy like Netflix, where the website is the product. If it's a more traditional business where you're just trying to offer information about your business and how to contact and, what kind of products you sell or whatever industry it is that you're in, put the website out of the cloud, enjoy that uptime, that reliability, the simplicity of having it out there. It's not very expensive to run something simple like a website out there. That's another great use for the cloud. But anything that's utility-based or core to the business, especially anything that's got proprietary or sensitive data behind it, customer records, names, addresses, employee records, things like social security numbers, or if you work in certain fields, things like medical or educational information, all that stuff, it's a lot safer to keep it on-prem because you've got much better control over it. And also any systems that are really utility-based that are only going to be consumed by the business's own employees, right? Like I said, the ERP system, like the HR, the payroll, or whatever, that's not stuff you need to make widely available out on the internet. It's really only going to be people working from home or in the office that need to access that. It makes the most sense from both a cost and security perspective to just keep running that in-house. But really, I think we're going to see this continued push to move to the cloud, and I hope that it doesn't turn into one of those scenarios where everybody does this big rush to go out to the cloud and then they realize that it's not what they were led it to be, what they were told it was going to be and how much better it was going to be. I also feel for the IT people who are telling their bosses, no, don't move to the cloud because it's only going to cost us more money and be more complex. And then they do, and then they get proven right and they have to pull it all back. It's a lot of wasted time and money and expense. So I think a metered approach to moving to these cloud services is the right one. But if I'm going to leave you with any little bit of information, if a lot of this was over your head, I'm sorry. Just remember this. There really is no cloud. It's just somebody else's computer. So with that, I'm curious, of course, as to your thoughts. Do you work in IT? Do you deal with cloud stuff from that back-end perspective? I'm curious as to your experience and your thoughts, your insights on it. As a consumer, maybe you don't work in IT, maybe you don't have anything to do with that stuff, but you are heavily dependent on cloud services for things like email or, watching movies like Netflix or streaming games, playing online games, that kind of stuff. I'm curious as to your thoughts on this as well. Do you think it's the right approach? Do you think all this shared stuff is the best way to go? Or do you think maybe for better security or isolation, companies like Sony and Microsoft should start running that stuff more on their own instead of farming it out to other companies? I'm just, of course, curious as to your thoughts, so be sure to leave those down in the comments below. Also, real quick, if you're interested in audio-only versions of these podcasts, I have them available to Patreon supporters at all contribution levels. You get early access to plain MP3 versions of these files, so you can just listen to them on whatever device you have, and Patreon supports RSS feeds, which is totally awesome, so just something to think about if you're interested. Anyway, if you like this one, I would appreciate a thumbs up. Be sure to subscribe if you haven't already. You can follow me on Twitter and Instagram at thisdoesnotcomp. And as always, thanks for watching.